Hello, it's good to be with you again. Today my topic is on the justification of the choice of a particular implementation strategy. It is the second talk in the series that will discuss in detail the design of an implementation strategy. Let me begin by giving you an overview of what I want to cover today. First, I'm going to introduce you some approaches to identify potential needs, barriers, and facilitators to implementation. Then, I'm going to talk about some factors that must be taken into account in the selection of the most appropriate implementation strategies, and this together with real-life examples. And finally, I'm going to present you a very recent study on specific methods that can be used to improve the selection of implementation strategies. So, the fundamental point that drives this segment is that, given several implementation strategies, we should give a clear justification of why the specific strategy was selected. If we choose a strategy that cannot be justified, then we should be careful about its application. So, at the end of this chapter, we hope that you will be able to use different methods, approaches to identify potential needs, barriers, or facilitators, to identify factors to be taken into account when selecting an implementation strategy, and also to apply these concepts in real-life situations. In the previous chapter, we saw that implementation strategies can be more or less complex, and that multifaceted strategies can be built combining several single strategies. We also present some approaches that can be used to describe and classify implementation strategies. Do you remember? We saw that strategies can be classified using, for example, implementation phases, but also according to main actors. So, in designing implementation strategies, we must make efforts to provide a clear justification to the strategy we use to implement a given intervention. Let's go back to the example related to the home management of malaria. One of the implementation strategies was training community-based providers. Do you remember? So, why did they choose this strategy and not another one, based, for example, on health providers? Before the selection of a particular strategy, we need to identify the needs, barriers, or facilitators, also called determinants of practice. Then, we must provide a clear justification of why the particular strategy was selected. Why would this implementation strategy help in overcoming potential barriers to implementation? This is the key question. The choice of the most appropriate implementation strategy is a complex job, and there is not a lot of information on this area. However, there is a very recent and growing work on the subject that can help us. For example, this study, published in 2013, presents a checklist with 57 potential determinants of practice, grouped in 7 domains: guideline factors, individual health professional factors, patient factors, professional interactions, incentives and resources, capacity for organizational change, social, political, and legal factors. The checklist presented in this paper is complemented with 5 worksheets to facilitate its use in implementation research and also in quality improvement projects. I strongly recommend you to take a look inside of the paper and to read carefully the content of the worksheets. The paper can be found in this link. So, the first question is how can we identify potential needs, barriers, or facilitators to implementation? There are several approaches. These determinants of practice can be identified through formal assessment process, using theory or conceptual models, using research literature, or using more informal approaches, such as brainstorming. Let us give some examples. We want to identify barriers or facilitators related to bed net delivery in African countries. We can use a revision of the literature. For example, this paper is on a systematic review on the subject, and the authors found that stockouts and poor logistics for bed net procurement and transport are potential barriers, and they also found that training and supervision of staff are potential facilitators to implementation. Another example is related to the community-directed interventions that you saw in the first module. Do you remember? In this case, there is a conceptual model of critical factors in the community-directed intervention that has already been developed. Now that we saw different approaches for the identification of the determinants of practice, we must try to provide a justification for the selection of a particular implementation strategy. Let's go back to the example related to the delivery of bed nets in African countries. What do we know? We know that appropriate use of bed nets can prevent malaria. However, the percentage of children under 5 sleeping under bed nets is still very low in many African countries. We need first to identify potential barriers to implementation, and then we select the most appropriate strategy. We know that in many countries, bed net distribution had been usually managed by the health system, many times in the context of immunization campaigns. At the time of this study, the concept of community-based distribution of bed nets was new. Why the particular strategy was selected? The strategies developed were based on previous effective strategies used to the control and elimination of other diseases. So, one possibility is to choose the implementation strategy based on empirical studies. But the selection of the most appropriate implementation strategy can also be done based on other factors. For example, relevant theory might be appropriate to address the specific challenge raised by implementation context. Another example is to base our choice in some pragmatic justification. Finally, I would like to bring your attention to a very recent study where specific methods are proposed to improve the selection of implementation strategies. In this paper, the authors propose a step-by-step process for selecting implementation strategies, but also for engaging stakeholders. This approach can be very useful to both researchers and program managers and can be used in very different contexts. However, because it is a very recent paper, there are still no practical examples related to diseases of poverty. I strongly recommend you to read this study, and who knows if you are not going to be pioneer in its application. So, don't forget, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, given several possible implementation strategies, which should give a clear justification of why the specific strategy was selected. If we choose a strategy that cannot be justified, then we should be careful about its application. So that brings me to the end of what I wanted to cover today. The next lecture will be on research designs and will be presented by Dr. Neil Alexander. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for your attention.